Hello students, welcome to ePathshala. My name is Ashima Gupta and I am an assistant professor in the postgraduate Government College for Girls, Sector 42, Chandigarh. This paper will broadly discuss about the concept of border and how it has been differently interpreted by various scholars. Borders not only determine the identity of a particular community but also define the identity of a nation and impacts its foreign policies. Borders as a political and historical problem have recently emerged into importance. The Romans actually started this practice of demarcating borders, and after them the practice was carried on through different ages. It came in Renaissance and acquired the form of cartography or building up of maps. Objectives: to understand the discourses on borders, constructed spaces of insecurity, to know border studies in contemporary South Asia, to know about the concept of border in international politics. International discourses. Traditionally, frontiers refer to territorial expansion of states in empty areas. Such an expansionist view of frontiers found its most well-known expression in the by now well-known views of Frederick Jackson Turner. It was a time when populists were hard at work filling the air with the cry for free silver. At such a conjuncture, Turner delivered his essay on the significance of the frontier in American history in the annual conference of the American Historical Association in 1893. Turner argued that it was the frontier that produced American democracy and individualism. The frontier stripped the European man of most of his cultural baggage and subordinated him to the disciplines of wilderness. More recently, David A. Chappell has produced a variant of the Turner thesis. He has argued that frontiers are zones of transformative interaction between systems. The German geographer Friedrich Ratzel, the father of geopolitics, made the first determined efforts to produce a set of laws that might enable the boundaries to be predicted. Ratzel believed that each state had an idea of the possible limits of its territorial dominion, and he termed it space conception. This concept was similar to the theories of natural boundaries which Pounds later on explored in respect of France in 1951. Ratzel's views reflected the evolution of Germany from an amalgamation of small marches, kingdoms and principalities into the greater German Empire. It is also significant that Ratzel produced his laws of expansion during the reigns of Wilhelm II. Students of geopolitics about 30 years later again popularized the view that border was the area within which the growth and decline of the state was organized. He said that a homogeneous population should have a cultural periphery beyond which should be the military boundary. Keeping in mind the next 10 years of history of Germany, it becomes clear why geopolitics was discredited after the Second World War. Between 1945 and 1989, most changes in the balance of power between adjoining states were not accompanied by changes in international boundaries, though it has to be kept in mind that the post-war boundaries were to change again within 50 years in Central and Eastern Europe and amongst CIS states. The French social scientists took up the mantle of boundary and border studies from the German geopoliticians in the late 1930s and 40s. It was around the time the French were discovering the connection between geography and history, and the most creative works on boundaries and borders began to be undertaken. The boundary was first debated at the political and then at the technical levels. The process of execution consisted of demarcation of the boundary on the ground. Apart from Lepradel, the two other social scientists who dealt with boundary and borders were Ansel and Pounds. Ensel held that boundaries are temporary lines where opposed power of neighboring states are neutralized. Bounds required prominence at the time when the French were trying to reassert their virility and identify after their psychological castration due to the fall of a Maginot Line. He established that for much of history after the 16th century, successive French rulers had regarded France's desirable boundaries as coinciding with the sea, Alpine watershed, the Pyrenees and the Rhine. Borders became markers of political control and revealed the consolidation of territorial gains. European imperial domains were carved out with little regard for tribal boundaries and even less regard for the requirement of a viable nation-state. The theories of border making that were developed in Western Europe were completely disregarded and new boundaries created in the Third World. The state elites then tried to legitimize their hegemony by imposing control over these borders. Thus, it was the joining of hands of former colonialists and the state elites that decided the borders of the Third World at a time when control over space began to be deemed critical for political hegemony by the Cold Warriors. Discourses on frontiers and borders, based on largely African and Latin American experiences, deal with this marker of territoriality and power from a different perspective. S. Wright Surk and Leela Garner Noble emphasizes the relation between the domestic and external in border making. This is the kind of history that borders create. To focus in border studies, as a result, has shifted from territory to its influence on the identities of the people, be it political, cultural, or any other. A study by W.F.S. Miles and D.A. Rochefort portrays how this has given rise to irredentism and cross-border conflicts in sub-Saharan Africa. Asiwaju, a famous African social scientist, focuses on the human factor in the formation of borders in Africa. It is this human factor which transforms the received colonial baggage to evolve a border where there was none. Discourses on South Asian borders. History books on South Asia suggest that South Asian borders has remained undemarcated for years, evoking little interest from the British colonialists and almost none from the Indians themselves. The Durant Line and the McMahon Line were conceived within 10 years of one another. Frontiers were quickly reduced to lines with little knowledge of what it actually entailed. Thus, South Asia probably had one of the first borderlands in the world. The great age of South Asian border studies had commenced with Curzon. Curzon had very definite views about the frontiers that he wanted for the British colonial empire. He advocated a scientific frontier which unites natural and strategic strength. And he was fully aware that as far as Asia was concerned, the idea of a demarcated frontier did not exist. Curzon's influence can be well gauged when we realize that we are still unable to get out of the mindset that we inherited from him, so much so that even today many South Asian states continue to deny their own citizens access to maps of border region, even outdated ones. There are a number of accounts by British officials that speak of their experiences in northeast frontiers. One such account is by George Dunbar, who was stationed in the present territory of Arunachal Pradesh, and he spoke a great deal about border and migration of these people. His reminiscences dealt with frontier people such as the Abors, the Mishimis, the Hilmiris, Nishis, and some of the Naga tribes. Quite unconsciously, Dunbar recorded at least 3 types of movements of people in this region. Dunbar speaks of different groups of migrants who had in the recent past migrated to these areas. One of them was the Kebangs, who migrated from Riu and established a powerful village. Another group, interestingly enough, were the Nepalese, whom he calls the Gurkhas. The Gazetteer of Naga and Manipur Hills, while discussing the state of immigration into these areas, speak of the Nepalese as the main foreign settlers in these regions. From the commentaries by British administrative officials, another trend was apparent. It was to mark the frontier as a space very different from the civilized world. This sense of difference underpinned their attitude towards the frontier people. These people were considered less than human, and so they could be treated with contempt. There was no need for civilized response to them. Dunbar spoke of different violent tribes such as Daflas. He said that the threat from the Daflas made it imperative for the British to establish outposts in the Akkad country. In another section of the frontier, there were massive flows of migrant people with diverse consequences. Different hill tribes in Tripura came from Upper Burma. There is one school of opinion that the people belonging to the hill tribes of Tripura were a branch of the Shan tribe of Burma. In the initial period, royal patronage encouraged migration from Bengal. The British government appointed their political agent in Agartala in 1871. Following this, the rulers of Tripura were encouraged to appoint administrators from Bengal. Some of the first magistrates were from Bengal. Migration from Bengal did not mean that other migrations from east and northeast stopped. In fact, migrations of groups such as Riangs, Kukis, Lucias, Mags, Chakmas and Tripurus continued. But these people did not come for administrative jobs. They arrived in search of Jhum lands. In most cases, grantees could get exemption from paying land revenue by giving free service to the state. After 1880, a number of rules came into force for regulating the land tenure system, which obviously needed a demarcation of borders. The next stage of border commentaries reaching us was during the 40s. The Second World War generated interest in borders not just in Europe but also in Asia. When Sir Robert Wright, the governor of Assam, 1939 to 1942, prepared his note on the future of the present excluded, partially excluded and tribal areas of Assam, he stressed the differences between the people of the administrative areas of the hills and plains ethnologically, linguistically and culturally. Immigrants from neighboring districts of Sylhet, Mimizing and Rangpur were populating the plains. The Bengalis were fast replacing the Assamese in the official dump. Bengali had to be made the language of the court in place of Persian, as there was numerous Bengalis in the administration, and when a Persian scribe went on leave, it was extremely expensive and difficult to replace them. They continued to occupy most of the white-collar jobs, much to the resentment of the Assamese. In other sectors such as trade, both wholesale and retail, the Marwaris enjoyed a monopoly. Besides trade, they acted as moneylenders and agents of tea garden managements. By 1941, the immigrants penetrated the then Lakhimpur district. After Sadullah became the Premier of Assam for the second time in August 1942, it is alleged that he attempted a systematic settlement of East Bengal Muslim peasants in Assam. To the Assamese opinion, the situation after 1947 became worse. Between 1958 and 1951, the number of Hindu refugees from East Pakistan rose from 4,87,000 to 6 lakh. The decade also witnessed a large inflow of migrants from other parts of India seeking economic opportunities in trading, construction work and white-collar jobs. It is alleged that during 1971, a large number of East Pakistanis fled to Assam and many of them did not return to their places of origin even after the formation of Bangladesh. Discourses on internal borders, mental borders, ethnic borders, etc. came to dominate the field until the end of Cold War and the resurgence of national security discourses. Border studies in contemporary South Asia. The last 2 decades have witnessed attempts at policies to make South Asian borders more rigid. Concepts of strategic frontiers were largely imperial and Western. When the British divided South Asia, they did it largely on paper. The ruling class have made those borders rigid due to power considerations. Only by making the borders static and rigid can the state hope to control them. A modern critique of border studies emerged with a critique of how power considerations were changing the character of borders in the post-colonial world. The Bengal Borderland Beyond State and Nation in South Asia by Willem van Schendel continued Samadar's critique further. Van Schendel urged his readers to look beyond the rigid category of borders and consider the space in its entirety. This work was followed by Willem van Schendel's work on borderlands, where he argued that borderlands are not merely margins of states, societies or nations, but a social and cultural system straddling international borders. In contemporary period, there is another strand of borderland studies that is growing robustly. Paula Banerjee's volume, Borders, Histories, Existences, Gender and Beyond, deals with the border and women's presence in it from a designated historical perspective and gives us a theoretical scaffolding of the subject. The book deals with histories of borders and histories of people across these borders who constantly subvert the existence of the borders. It deals with the superstructure of security, that effort to control and harness these bordered existences, leading to circles of insecurities across the border. At the epicenter of these circles of insecurity are women who are constantly negotiating with the border for their survival. In this contemporary critique of border or borderland studies, the authors foreground violence and subversion as the two major themes. They argue that violence is a constitutive element of borderlands when analyzed from a gender perspective. Violence foregrounds women's experiences in all the borders, even the ones considered as benign. But with violence, there is also the story of resistance, perhaps not glorious, grandiose or heroic resistance. But in women's narratives, those stories are few and far between. Therefore, contemporary analysis of borders portrays borders as spaces of security and insecurity that impacts on certain marginality. It also portrays how marginal groups subvert and challenge power formations, that celebrates the agentive politics of groups that are often considered as permanent exceptions to state formations. To conclude, borders have a range of scholarship in themselves. They have been differently interpreted by various academicians and they have emerged into importance only after the fall of Soviet Union and the emergence of Cold War. They are symbols of political control and determine the identity of a nation and their people. Lord Curzon, when dividing Bengal, always thought that border was a very critical component which actually decided about major issues such as war and peace. This paper also further discussed the difference between the western type of borders and the eastern borders.